Hello everyone, my name is Ozan. I'm a research fellow at BEST, and this is joint work with Onurcan Yılmaz from Kadir Has University, and we thank our sponsor the Think Forward initiative. I'm going to be talking about how to activate intuitive and reflective thinking in behavioral research. So this is a methods paper. Hopefully some of the experimental researchers in particular could perhaps make use of it. As most of you will know, there are two fundamental concepts in modern behavioral research. On the one hand, intuition, referring to fast, automatic, and low-effort thinking, and on the other hand, reflection, referring to slow, controlled, and high-effort thinking. This was popularized, of course, by Daniel Kahneman's bestseller, Thinking Fast and Slow, and also widely used in academic research, especially with regard to dual process models. I'll be talking about how to activate these two ways of thinking, but one thing perhaps to note is that we don't necessarily talk about black and white kind of differences, but relative differences. So manipulations that generate relatively more reflective thinking and relatively more spontaneous or intuitive thinking is the goal here. And these manipulations are widely used in experimental research, and I'll show some examples from my own research because that's what I know the best. But across various domains, including cooperation. In the one on the left, religion, parochialism, and intuitive cooperation, we looked at religious believers and how their cooperative decisions and whether or not they are intuitive as currently hypothesized. What we showed was, in fact, it was the opposite, that reflection increased cooperation, and the way we manipulated reflection was through comparing time pressure, decisions made under time pressure versus decisions made under time delay. Using a similar manipulation in a separate paper, we looked at the cognitive underpinnings of strong reciprocity in one-shot cooperation decisions and showed again that reflection actually increases cooperation, which is against the current dominant hypothesis of intuitive cooperation. In another domain, religious belief, we looked at how again, the cognitive underpinnings of belief in God, and found that, in fact, reflection increases belief in God through self-questioning among non-believers in particular. So this, again, goes against the current dominant paradigm in this particular domain. And various other studies are extended across various domains, including morality and politics, using similar manipulations. What I am going to do today is to compare the available and often used techniques in the literature for manipulating intuitive and reflective thinking, because there are a couple of methodological problems currently. Most importantly, the relative effectiveness of these techniques is not well established. There are multiple techniques, and each researcher has their own favorite one, so it's often difficult to make comparisons between these previous findings, and often researchers rely on self-reports as manipulation checks, and those self-reports could often be biased by things like socially desirable responding. And so what we will be doing is to look at performance measures as the outcome. When we look at the literature, there's actually only two papers who has done something similar. Deck et al., which is a working paper, have considered only intuition manipulations. And we have published Judgment and Decision Making 2 years ago, a comparison of only reflection manipulations. So what we will be doing in this project is to compare both intuition and reflection manipulations together, because in practice often they are used together, such as, for example, comparing time delay to time pressure manipulations. What we had found in that previous paper was that activating reflective thinking with decision justification, basically asking people to justify their decisions as they are giving answers to things like the cognitive reflection test, improved their performance the most. And similarly, de-biasing training, basically exposing people to certain common biases, such as the conjunction fallacy, and then giving them feedback about what that bias is about, informing them about that, also increased performance in similar tests. In the present study, which is a large-scale online experiment, nearly 4,000 people, We used as our outcome measure 5-item cognitive performance test, which includes the cognitive reflection, the standard cognitive reflection test, plus 2 items common biases from the judgment and decision making literature. And the most famous of these questions is, as you know, the bat and the ball question. There may be some people who may not know, so I'll just quickly go over it. A bat and ball cost $1, £1.10. We had the UK population in this experiment. In total, the bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? The reflective and the correct answer here, as you know, is 5 pence. However, the intuitive and incorrect answer is 10 pence. And so we use these 2 different responses to come up with the reflection score, and on the other hand, the intuition score. And any other answer is basically both non-intuitive but still incorrect, and that gives us the error score. We'll focus first on the reflection score across these 5 questions, basically the correct answers to these 5 questions. We compared 16 different manipulations in the literature. 8 of these are reflection manipulations, 6 of them are intuition manipulations, and 2 of them are 2 response manipulations, which basically in a within subject design first elicits intuitive responses, often under time pressure, and then ask the same people to think through their initial answers, and if they wanted to revise them. And that's the 2 response manipulation. And we also had 2 control conditions. Here's a description of those. Let me quickly go over them. We had 2 controls, passive and an active control. The active control had a writing component because many of the actual manipulations involve writing. In the intuition conditions, we had the recall, which is basically think about an episode in your life where intuition helped, and similar version of that manipulation we had also for reflection in terms of, which is called the reason recall. We also had induction manipulations, either asking people to rely on their emotion or asking people to rely on their reason while they're answering the questions. We also have compared 2 different versions of time pressure, 5 seconds and 10 seconds, to 2 different versions of time delay, 10 seconds and 20 seconds. Additional reflection manipulations include monetary incentives, which is basically giving people money for correct answers. Decision justification, as I explained, basically asking people to justify their decisions in a text box. And then 2 versions of the debiasing training that provides feedback on common biases. 2 different versions of the 2 response method that I just explained. And going back to the intuition manipulations, we also had the online version of the cognitive load manipulations, which is basically thinking about a number or some type of a figure while they are answering questions, which should, by design, put some load in the working memory. So that is the experiment, basically, to compare the performance across these conditions on the reflection test. And here is the result, or the results. Basically, when you look at the gray bars at the bottom, those are gives us and that basically becomes the dotted line. That is the overall control, the average of the 2 controls. So the average performance in the control conditions is around 2.2 out of 5 questions, and anything to the left in terms of the other colored bars means that the people under those conditions performed worse than the control, and those who were higher than that dotted line, they performed better than the control. The red bars are the intuition conditions, as you might guess, since most of those are below that dotted line. In fact, except 1 condition, the intuition recall, all of the intuition manipulations were successful, but the most successful one, perhaps somewhat surprisingly, in my opinion, was the emotion induction, basically asking people to rely on their emotion before they answered the questions. And looking at the blue bars, which are the reflection manipulations, the most and some of the commonly used manipulations actually failed quite clearly, and our recommendation is not to use them any longer in future research, including the brief time delay, the reason induction, and the reason recall failing quite miserably. But on the other hand, we also have quite clear successes, in particular the debiasing and the long debiasing in particular were the most successful reflection manipulations, but in addition, decision justification and monetary incentives conditions were also successful. I won't go into the details of these two graphs, which is basically the intuition scores and error scores, but intuition scores are very much in line with the reflection scores. When you look at the panel on the right that looks at the error scores, the interesting thing there was the time pressure manipulation, which is the most commonly used manipulation for increasing intuition, actually also increased error scores as well. Those answers which were non-intuitive but still incorrect. And that basically means that time pressure increases noise in the data, and that's a disadvantage to that manipulation. Looking at the reflection manipulations, interesting finding was decision justification actually lowered error scores. So asking people to justify their decisions therefore decreases noise in the data, and that's an advantage to that method. So overall, our summary is that, and this is our recommendation, the most effective techniques to use for reflection is the long debiasing training. The most effective manipulation for activating intuition is to use the emotion induction, but there are additional reflection and intuition manipulations that are effective, such as the short debiasing, the decision justification, and the monetary incentives on the reflection side, and time pressure and cognitive load are also successful in terms of activating intuition. But there are few often used manipulations that researchers should no longer use, including recall manipulations on both sides, but also reason induction and brief time delay, like 10 to 20 second time delay should also not be used. That is it. Thank you very much.